You don't lack discipline. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and that's the problem, because everything you've been told about discipline assumes that your brain is on your side. It's not, at least not in the way you think. Your brain doesn't care about your long-term goals. It doesn't care about the version of yourself you're trying to become. It doesn't care about consistency, productivity, or potential. It cares about one thing: efficiency, survival, immediate reward. And if you don't understand that, you will spend years doing exactly what I did, fighting a system you don't even realize is controlling you. I used to think I was just weak, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me, because I knew what to do. I had the plan, the goals, the intention, but when it came time to act, something always pulled me away, not aggressively, quietly, almost invisibly. I'd sit down to study and suddenly feel the urge to check something real quick. I'd plan to work and find myself delaying for no clear reason. I'd promise myself I'd change, and somehow repeat the same patterns again. And the worst part? It didn't feel like I was making bad decisions. It felt like I was choosing. That illusion cost me more than I realized at the time. Because I wasn't failing loudly. I was drifting, losing focus in small moments, avoiding effort in ways that felt harmless, delaying things that didn't feel urgent until they became irreversible. And by the time I understood what was happening, some opportunities were already gone, not because I wasn't capable, but because I was inconsistent for too long. Hey, you're watching Myth Eryndor. If something in this feels uncomfortably accurate, stay with me. This isn't about motivation, it's about understanding the system you've been trapped in. And if you want more of this kind of clarity, subscribe now, because what we're about to uncover will change how you see your own mind. Because here's the shift that changed everything for me. I stopped asking, why can't I be disciplined? And started asking, what is my brain actually trying to do? That question leads you into something most people never explore. Your brain is constantly scanning for the easiest path. In neuroscience, this is called cognitive ease. It means your mind is always trying to minimize effort and maximize reward, not later, now. So when you choose to scroll instead of work, when you delay instead of start, when you avoid instead of act, that's not a failure of character. That's a successful execution of your brain's default programming. And here's where it gets dangerous. Because if you keep relying on motivation, on forcing yourself, you are trying to override millions of years of evolution with temporary emotion that will never last. So instead of fighting your brain, you need to design for it. You need to build a system where the right behavior becomes the easiest behavior, where starting requires almost no effort, where distraction is harder to access, where action happens before hesitation even has time to appear. Because discipline is not something you feel, it's something you structure. And if you don't build that structure, your brain will build one for you, automatically, unconsciously. And that system will always choose comfort over growth. So the real question is no longer, do you have discipline? It's this: are you living inside a system that makes discipline possible? Or one that guarantees you will fail no matter how hard you try? Because once you see that clearly, you stop blaming yourself and you start looking at something much deeper, something that has been shaping your behavior this entire time. And once you begin to question your brain, the next realization becomes unavoidable. If your mind is always choosing the easiest path, then what exactly determines what easy looks like in your daily life? Because this is where everything shifts. For a long time, I thought my behavior was a result of my decisions. But when I started observing more carefully, almost like I was studying my own patterns from the outside, I noticed something that didn't make sense at first. I wasn't consistent in different environments. I was predictable within them, same goals, same intentions, but completely different behaviors depending on where I was, what was around me, and what was immediately available. That's not personality, that's context. From a neuroscience perspective, your brain is constantly interacting with cues, visual, physical, and emotional signals in your environment. These cues trigger behavioral loops before you even consciously process them. You don't wake up and decide everything from scratch. Your brain recognizes patterns and responds automatically. Cue to action to reward. Over time, this loop becomes embedded, not because you chose it, but because it was repeated in the same conditions. That means your environment is not passive, it is actively programming your behavior. I realized this in a way that was almost frustratingly simple. When my phone was within reach, I used it without thinking. When it wasn't, I didn't even feel the urge. Nothing about my willpower changed, only the environment did. And yet the behavior changed instantly. That's when it became clear. Discipline is not about resisting your environment. It's about redesigning it so resistance becomes unnecessary, because your brain is always asking one silent question: what is the easiest action I can take right now? And it answers that question based on what is visible, accessible, and requires the least effort to begin. So if distraction is one tap away, and meaningful work requires setup, effort, and uncertainty, your brain has already made the decision before you even feel like you have a choice. That's why trying to be disciplined inside a poorly designed environment feels exhausting. You're not just doing the task, you're fighting the system around you, and that fight drains energy faster than you realize. So instead of asking yourself to become stronger, I started doing something much more practical. I started designing my environment to guide my behavior, not in a dramatic way. In small, precise adjustments, I made the behaviors I wanted more visible. I reduced the steps required to start them. I placed them directly in the path of my daily routine, and just as importantly, I increased friction for the behaviors I wanted to avoid, not by removing them completely, but by making them slightly harder to access. Because even a small increase in friction is enough to redirect behavior. This is how you build discipline at a neurological level. You're not forcing the brain, you're guiding its natural tendency. You're aligning with cognitive ease instead of fighting it. And when you do that, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop relying on willpower, because the environment starts doing part of the work for you. The right action becomes easier to start, the wrong one becomes easier to avoid, and over time these small shifts compound into patterns that begin to feel like identity. But even after understanding this, I ran into something I couldn't ignore. There were moments where everything was set up correctly, no distractions, no barriers, and still I didn't act. There was a pause, a hesitation, as if something deeper than the environment was holding me back. And that's when I realized designing the system is only part of the solution, because even in the perfect environment, something still has to trigger the first move, and that's where the next layer begins. And that deeper layer The one that keeps pulling you back even after you understand your brain, is where I had to confront something I didn't expect. Maybe the problem wasn't just inside my mind, but embedded in everything around me, because once I stopped blaming myself and started observing patterns more carefully, I noticed something almost disturbing. My behavior wasn't just influenced by my brain, it was being triggered constantly by my environment, not in obvious ways, in subtle, almost invisible cues, where my phone was placed, what was within reach, what was already open, what required just a little bit more effort. These tiny details were shaping my actions long before I had the chance to decide. And once I saw that clearly, something shifted. I stopped asking, "Why am I so inconsistent?" and started asking, "What is my environment training my brain to do?" Because that's what it really is, training. Every time you repeat an action in a specific context, your brain links them together. Same place leads to same behavior. Same trigger leads to same response. This is how habits form at a neurological level. The brain builds associations between cues and actions, strengthening them through repetition until they become automatic, which means your environment is not neutral. It is actively wiring your behavior, whether you realize it or not. I started noticing this in my own life in ways I couldn't ignore. If my phone was on my desk, I would check it without thinking. If my workspace was cluttered, my focus would drift. If distractions were visible, my attention would fragment, not occasionally, predictably. And the more I paid attention, the more obvious it became. I wasn't choosing these behaviors. I was responding to cues. That's when the idea of discipline started to feel almost misleading, because it assumes you are the one in control at the moment of action. But most of the time, the action has already been set in motion by the environment. So instead of trying to fight that moment, I shifted my focus to something much earlier, the setup. Because if the brain responds automatically to cues, then changing the cues changes the behavior, not instantly, but reliably. This is where discipline becomes something practical, something you can build. You don't need to eliminate distractions completely. You need to redesign their accessibility, move them further away, hide them from immediate view, add small barriers that interrupt automatic responses. At the same time, you bring the behaviors you want closer, visible, ready, easy to start. A book on the table instead of inside a bag. Your work already open before you sit down. Your tools prepared in advance so there's no delay. These changes seem small, almost insignificant, but to your brain they are everything, because they alter the path of least resistance, and your brain always follows that path. That's the mechanism, not motivation, not willpower, just direction. And once you align your environment with the behavior you want, something interesting happens. The internal resistance starts to decrease, not because you became stronger, but because the system stopped working against you. You're no longer trying to override your brain. You're guiding it subtly, consistently, and over time, those small adjustments compound. What once required effort begins to feel natural. What once felt difficult becomes automatic, and that's when you realize you were never missing discipline. You were surrounded by cues that reinforce the opposite. But even with the right environment, even with the right setup, there's still one moment that determines everything. The moment where action either begins or doesn't, because sometimes, even when everything is perfectly aligned, you still hesitate, and that hesitation reveals something deeper than environment, something that sits between intention and action, something you can't ignore anymore once you see it. And that hesitation, that split second where everything is ready, yet nothing happens, is where the real mechanism of discipline reveals itself. Because by that point, your environment is no longer the problem. Your brain understands the cues, the path is clear, the friction is reduced, and still you pause. That pause is not random, it's neurological, because starting an action requires a specific kind of energy, what neuroscience often refers to as activation energy, not physical effort, cognitive initiation. Your brain has to transition from a passive state to an active one, and that transition is where most behaviors fail, not in the middle, not at the end, at the beginning. For years I misunderstood this. I thought discipline meant pushing through resistance, but resistance wasn't the real enemy. Uncertainty was. Every time I had to decide when to start, how to start, or how long to continue, I was introducing friction back into the system, even if everything else was optimized. So I stopped focusing on effort and started focusing on initiation. How do you make starting so simple that your brain doesn't resist it? That question led me to something surprisingly practical. Your brain already runs on sequences, automatic chains of behavior. You wake up, you reach for your phone, you sit down, you open a distraction, you feel bored, you escape. These aren't conscious choices, they're loops. And once a loop is established, it runs with almost no effort. So instead of trying to create new behaviors from scratch, I began attaching them to existing ones. Not later, not eventually, immediately. After brushing my teeth, I would read one page. After making coffee, I would open my work. After sitting down, I would start the smallest possible version of the task. No delay, no thinking, just continuation. At first, it felt too small to matter, but that's exactly why it worked. Because the brain doesn't resist small actions, it resists unclear ones. The moment an action feels defined, contained, and easy to begin, the resistance drops. This is where you start to build what looks like discipline, but it's actually something else. It's automaticity. Your brain begins to associate one action with the next, cue to behavior to completion. And once that sequence is repeated enough times, it becomes a default, not something you decide, something you do. But there's another layer that makes this even more effective. Reward, not in the obvious sense. You don't need massive gratification. Your brain is sensitive to completion, to closure. Even a small sense of done reinforces the loop. So when you design a behavior, it needs to end with something recognizable, a check mark, a visible progress marker, a moment of acknowledgement. Sequences do, systems do, and once those systems are in place, something subtle happens. You stop asking yourself if you feel like doing something, because the question never appears. The action has already begun. But even with all of this, there's still one layer deeper, because you can build systems, you can create loops, you can make behavior easier and still feel like something is missing, like you're acting but not fully becoming. And that's where the final shift begins. Not in what you do, but in who you believe you are while doing it. And that quiet feeling, that sense that you're doing the right things but not fully becoming the person behind them, is where everything finally comes together. Because this is no longer about behavior, it's about identity. And this is where I had to confront something I didn't expect. I wasn't inconsistent because I lacked systems anymore. I wasn't distracted because my environment was wrong. I was stuck because of how I saw myself. You can design the most effective system in the world. You can reduce friction, build habits, create automatic loops. But if your internal identity doesn't match those actions, your brain will slowly pull you back, not forcefully, subtly. Because the brain is not just a machine for behavior, it's a machine for consistency, not behavioral consistency, identity consistency. There's a concept in neuroscience called cognitive dissonance. When your actions don't align with your self-image, your brain experiences tension, and it resolves that tension in one of two ways. You either change your behavior or you reinterpret your behavior to fit your identity. Most people choose the second option without realizing it. I did it for years. I would act differently for a moment, study, train, focus, and instead of letting that action reshape how I saw myself, I dismissed it. That's not really me. I'm just trying something new. I won't keep this up. Subtly. And just like that, the action lost its power. Because it didn't become evidence, it remained an exception, which meant my identity never changed. And because my identity didn't change, my behavior always returned to its old baseline. That's the loop. You don't fall back because you're weak. You fall back because your brain is trying to stay consistent with who it believes you are. So the real shift isn't just in what you do, it's in what you allow yourself to believe those actions mean. Every small behavior is not just a task, it's a signal, a piece of data your brain uses to update its model of you. And if you ignore those signals, you stay the same. But if you start recognizing them intentionally, something changes. Not immediately, but gradually. Every time you follow through, even in a small way, you're giving your brain new evidence, not dramatic proof, but consistent signals. I am someone who starts. I am someone who follows through. I am someone who shows up. At first it feels artificial, because the old identity is still louder, still more familiar, still reinforced by years of repetition. But your brain doesn't prioritize what's old. It's something you build through repetition, through small, consistent actions that your brain can no longer ignore. So the question is no longer, can you be disciplined? The question is, what identity are you reinforcing every single day without noticing? Because whatever that answer is, that's the person your brain is working to become. What you've just seen is not a lesson about discipline. It's a dismantling of an illusion. For most of my life, I believed that consistency was something you forced, something you earned through pressure and self-control. But the deeper truth is far less heroic and far more practical. Your life is not shaped by what you intend, but by what your system makes easy. Every repeated action, every avoided task, every moment of delay is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of your design. When your environment, your habits, and your identity are misaligned, you don't rise, you drift, and you keep drifting until you believe that's just who you are. The lesson here is simple but not easy. Stop trying to become stronger and start becoming more intentional. Instead of asking, why can't I do this? Ask, what is making this hard to do? Then change that. Make the right action obvious. Reduce the friction and let repetition reshape how you see yourself. That's how real change begins, not through intensity, but through structure. So here's a simple question for you. What is one habit in your life right now that feels hard? Not because you're weak, but because your system is working against you. Share your answer in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. And if this made you rethink the way you see yourself, consider subscribing to Myth Eryndor to support the channel and stay with us for deeper insights ahead.